Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to see all of you here. I'm seeing a lot of people joining from across the United States and from across the world. My name is Nadine Hoffman. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at the International Women's Media Foundation, and I'm really delighted to be moderating today's conversation. And I'm delighted to be here with our partners from the Committee to Protect Journalists and from PEN America, with whom the International Women's Media Foundation has co-organized this election summer safety series. And I know we do have some international folks in the room today, which is great. Our sessions for the next 6 weeks, and this is the first of 6 sessions, are specifically going to be geared towards journalists covering US elections. But I do acknowledge this is a super election year across the world, and we know that the materials and the knowledge that we're going to be able to share will be relevant to you in many cases, regardless of your geography. So we're really excited also to acknowledge additional partners beyond CPJ, PEN, and IWMF who have supported in creating this series. And those include ONA, the American Press Institute, Report for America, the Indigenous Journalists Association, SPJ, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and ACOS Alliance. So over the next 6 weeks, we welcome you to join us every Tuesday at this time at noon Eastern time, where we'll be covering a holistic set of safety topics from today's topic, which is risk assessment. So we'll cover physical security. We'll also cover digital security. We'll cover legal safety, and finally, psychosocial safety. So if you join us for all of these sessions, you will be able to get a really comprehensive toolkit that we hope will help you this election year and beyond to be able to do your work more safely. I also want to acknowledge that the reason we're focusing on the US this year, in addition to US elections, is simply the fact that journalist safety is unfortunately declining in this country, as we've seen recently from the World Press Freedom Index. The US slipped 10 places on the list to number 55 in terms of press freedom. We are hearing from journalists across the country that they face threats from hostile politicians, from aggressive law enforcement, from even contentious school board meetings. They're facing the threat of doxing. And we know that local journalists and freelancers are especially at risk. I will very briefly share some top-line statistics from the IWMF's Newsroom Safety Across America tour, where we've been working with journalists in swing states to prepare them ahead of elections. And of almost 400 journalists that we've trained, about 40% of them told us that they had experienced threats of or actual physical violence in their reporting. 30% said they had experienced digital threats and attacks. And almost 30% also expressed that they had experienced legal threats. We know that journalists are facing online violence from right-wing extremist groups. We know they're being threatened and attacked and arrested at protests and rallies. And we know that editors especially are looking for tools on how to keep their journalists safer in the field, as well as journalists themselves. So if you are a journalist, if you are an ally of journalists, if you are an editor, you've come to the right place, because we're going to give you some really practical tools to be able to do your work more safely. And risk assessment is really at the core of all safety training for journalists. At the IWMF and CPJ and PEN, we all believe in identity-informed risk assessment, which is to say that one size does not fit all when it comes to risk. And so today, to lead us through this session, we're really lucky to have 2 excellent trainers, Jeje Mohamed and Jen Byers, who are going to take us through an introduction to risk assessment. And with that, I am going to pass it off to them.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Today, we're going to be talking about risk assessment. And I just want to introduce myself and then pass it to Jen to introduce themselves. My name is Jeje Mohamed, and I am a safety and security advisor and trainer, previously a journalist. And now I'm here doing this work because, as Nadine mentioned earlier, the risk to journalists around the world and in the US, around specifically elections, is increasing, and we're trying our best to provide journalists with the tips and tools that they need so that they can mitigate these dangers as much as possible. And I would pass it to Jen.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jen Byers. I've been a journalist in the US for about a decade, and I've covered a lot of the major kind of major intense events, protests in the US. I covered Standing Rock. I was really prevalent for so many protests. Black Lives Matter. I was present for a lot of the Palestine protests, anti-abortion stuff, and I travel a lot in the US, so I'm kind of constantly on the ground assessing these issues. I covered the 2020 election for Al Jazeera Arabic in rural Pennsylvania, and kind of since then have also been doing kind of a lot of research about the rise of different armed groups on sort of like all ends of the spectrum. So I'm really excited to share some of this information with you guys just to help keep you safe. And remember, if you have any questions or anything you want us to elaborate on, you can throw that in the chat at any time, and we will try to respond if we're not talking. So happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Jen. And let's start. First, I want to just highlight that you can take a picture of this, and it has all of the sessions that are going to be coming. Today is the beginning. This is the kickoff of the series, and it's going to be risk assessment and planning. Next week is going to be online abuse and self-defense by PEN America, and it will be me and my colleague Victoria. Then protecting against hacking and doxing, legal rights and resources, journalist safety covering the election, specifically with protests, policing, and crowds. And lastly, protecting mental health in the face of online and offline attacks. So make sure to take a note of the dates and the times. It's going to be 12 to 1:30 on these dates. These are some community agreements for us. And to answer a question that was in the chat as well, the chat is open for us, for panelists. So any questions that you have, any comments that you want to share, please feel free to do that. We will share some of these inputs, and this session is going to be interactive. So we will ask you for your input, to answer some of the questions we will pose, and we will be reading them. So we're going to just respect your privacy. We will just read the answers for these questions without attributing them to anyone. So feel free to answer the questions and engage with us. And to start with some community agreements, I just want to make sure to say that the content we're going to be covering might be very triggering for some people. It's heavy. These all sessions will include risks and threats that journalists are facing. So I just want to say that please take care of yourself. If you need to take a break, if you need to go grab water, whatever that works for you, please make sure to do that. This session is recorded, and it will be available for you to review again later. And we will make sure to be sharing also resources across. And also, please ask us any questions. We will make sure to take notes and follow and answer as many questions as we can. We want to center learning and growth. Any information that we share here is for you to share with others. Now, as I said earlier, the privacy of people are respected because only us as panelists can see what people are sharing. So we're not going to be attributing things to people. Collective accountability and respect. It's important to respect each other and each other's experiences, and to have this conversation open and in good faith, and to make space for each other to grow and to share tips with each other, because you all have been doing this work for many, many years. And maybe some of you are still new to the field, but this is how we learn. We learn from each other's experiences, and this is something very important. And again, bio breaks. This is more to in person, but still, if you want to go get water or if you want to go use the restroom, please feel free to do that. If you can in the chat, actually, tell us which puppy you are and drop your name. I know that some of you have been doing that already, so thank you. Drop your name, your pronoun, and one of the security threats that you're facing or concerned about, and one thing you're hoping to learn. We're going to keep an eye on that, and we will try to cover as much as possible today. If not, it's going to be in the relevant sessions to follow.
Okay. Okay, so welcome everyone. So today's going to be about risk assessment and planning for journalists covering elections on the field, in the ground. It's going to be very practical, very based, kind of like on the ground. So one of the things that I want to note is I'm sure many of y'all have encountered a lot of what we're going to talk about today, but just like when you renew your CPR certification and just refresh your memory on how to do this stuff, risk assessment is a really good thing to kind of constantly refresh on. We'll go into this later, but we're going to talk about how risk is something that is constantly changing, and a risk assessment is not something that is kind of a once and done scenario. So, of course, risks are not rigid. And so if, for example, you've encountered some of this information already before, we kind of invite you to think about, what are the new risks that you're encountering? If you can use this session kind of as a way to imagine your own planning, as well as taking the information, like, then we're going to feel successful. So yeah.
So now, as I said, and as I said earlier, this session is interactive. So the first question, and we would like your engagement, is what does risk mean to you? And what does mitigation mean to you? Before we go into details and explain it, and I know that, like, honestly, a lot of journalists are kind of allergic to the word risk assessment, but we promise we're going to make this as simple as possible for you to apply. And it doesn't have to be a very long, painful process, but it's how we change our thinking around risks and mitigation. But I would like to know how you're thinking about it. We can take a couple of seconds, and then me and Jen will share some of the answers we'll be receiving here. Risk means a vulnerability that exists but not certain. Mitigation means a step to reduce risk. Very nice. Risk means things that might harm me plus my team. Yes. What else? Do you think that risk and mitigation changes from a place to another, from a person to another, or do you think it's the same? Yes, it can even change in the moment. Amazing, wonderful. Yes. Mitigation means addressing risks, knowing and thinking about risks. Risk also means potential harm to my family. Really good. It may change on how a person identifies. Yes. It changes from a place to place and different for each person. Amazing. That's really wonderful. So risk is definitely, as you all mentioned, it's something that might pose a harm to you, to your team, or you as a person, as individual, but also to your relatives or things that are around you in your space. Mitigation are the things that when we think about the risk and then we think about what are the things that I can implement as a person to make this risk whether less likely to happen, or if it occurs, if it happens, it's less harmful. So we're trying to play with two different things: the possibility of the risk happening, but also in case that risk happened, how can we make the damage as less as possible, as little as possible? Set of circumstances or situations that can harm oneself or others. Risk means exposure, mitigation means planning. Wow, this is a very lovely group. Thank you, everyone, for engaging. So the way we think about risks is that it's holistic. We cannot necessarily think about risks as, for example, only physical dangers or physical security risks that we face in a field. We cannot think about it as only the digital threats like doxing or harassment. We cannot only think about it like legal as like someone filing a lawsuit against me, or like the harm that will do to me psychologically. We cannot think about each of these aspects in silos. They are all very interconnected, and they are all very intersectional. So it's very important to think about risk in a holistic way, which means including all of the pillars that you see in front of you now on the screen. And we think about them together, because while we're talking, and we'll ask you for your input as well, you will see that like some of these risks actually affect each other. And when we think about mitigating them, we have to think about that as well.
So part of also having a holistic analysis of risk is dropping it into categories, showing kind of exactly what we mean by this. So risk can be physical, it can be reputational, psychosocial, that's with your mental health or your relationships. It can be cyber or digital, it can be financial, or it can be legal. Is there, right now in the next slide, we're gonna show some examples of it, but is there anything under these categories that, is really particularly relevant to you guys, or any categories that you think we're missing right off the bat? No? Okay, cool. We can move to the next slide. So just to go in a little bit deeper, So some examples of, physical risk is kind of the most obvious thing that, people are worried about. Things like, going to a protest and getting beat up, things like getting pepper sprayed or tear gassed, things like getting shot at or getting crushed in a crowd. But there's also all of these other dynamics. So reputational, smear campaigns, impersonation, defamation, especially with AI, we've seen things like impersonation become a lot more of a higher risk in the last in the last year. Psychosocial could be examples of harassment, trauma, burnout, isolation, or loss of relationships. I think anyone who's kind of covered really dangerous things can know that after you cover a really dangerous thing, it can be really hard to relate to others. That isolation that might affect your personal or private life, that is a risk to the job, and it is a risk at this work. Cyber is kind of another pretty obvious threat that a lot of folks are experiencing, whether it's doxing or online harassment, or even things like data theft or being scammed. I also want to note the prevalence of stingrays, which is a technology that is largely used by police and law enforcement to intercept data at protests or events. So that's sort of a cyber risk as well, because we see basically cyber technologies used to survey journalists. If anyone is a journalist in Mexico, they probably know about Pegasus, which is another cyber risk that basically it's like a bug that can get on your phone and take all your information, and people can use it to track you, and it's super dangerous. Financial risks can be everything from, professional precarity to all of the layoffs, to not being certain that your job's going to be there, to medical bills or legal bills if you get roughed up at an event. And finally, we have legal risks, which are everything from sort of you getting accused of defamation or libel, to copyright, to trespassing, to being arrested, which again, as Nadine said from the jump, we're seeing a lot more arrests of journalists, very obviously performing their jobs. So that's a risk that is going up. There's even things such as subpoenas and search and seizures. Subpoenas and search and seizures tend to either be more for like the entire newsroom subpoenas, or for more independent journalists. We've seen sort of basically in the wake of 2020, both newsrooms, I think it was the Seattle Times, got targeted with a subpoena to basically give their data to local law enforcement. And then individuals we saw in the wake of 2020 in particular getting searched by the police in an attempt for the police to take their data. So these are very real things that are happening in the US, and very real things that could continue to happen during this election cycle. Yeah, are there any other things that you guys are worried about? Just kind of different topics?
I want to share some of the things in the chat because
Yeah.
it's really interesting for people to know about. So a lot of the answers we're getting are some concerns about physical and cyber attacks as top threats. We had someone sharing that a person they know have been targeted with the use of cognites. I'm not very sure about what cognite is exactly and how it's being used. Someone said a lot of these threats are concerning: arrest, harassment, trauma, burnout, isolation, civil unrest, crowd crushes. They've experienced all of that except for arrest, and they're worried about that, about being arrested. They worried about being arrested in the past year. Someone sharing that covering the Colombia protests, a lot of journalists and student journalists were regularly worried about physical, psychosocial, and legal risks, cyber risks, reputational risk, financial. Cyber is probably biggest concern. We will have two sessions next week. The next session and the one after, both are about cyber protection and cyber risks on online harassment. Smear campaigns, social media, generative AI, deep fakes, physical attacks and assaults are coming from law enforcement as per the US Press Freedom Tracker. We're going to mention a lot of these things, and each session we have will touch on some of these things in different ways. So please make sure to follow with us the coming sessions as well. Now, the way we think about risks and mitigating them is, or managing them, we think about it in 3 different phases: the before, the during, and after. So when we think about risk, it's not necessarily only the thing that happens to me in the field. If I am covering the protest, it's not necessarily about that only. We have a lot of things to think about in advance before I go on an assignment. If I know that, for example, if I'm going to be covering one of the conventions, or if I'm going to be covering a polling station in the elections, some of the things that I will need to do is to prepare beforehand, before I go on that assignment. And what I do in that part is that I do my risk assessment, which I promise we will talk about it in a more simple way than what you all think about. And how can we create a contingency plan? Then we do our research. All of us, or the majority of people are here, are journalists. We're very good at researching things. So how can we use the skill that we use on a daily aspect in our job to actually research risks, to make sure that we keep ourselves safe? Then we have some things to think about. What are the physical preparations that I need to do? Whether that's clothing, whether that's where I will be staying, what car I'm going to using, what car I'm going to be using, what is the weather like? A lot of things. What do I need? I need food, water, snacks. Do I have all of these things? Do I need a personal protective equipment, PPE? So these are some of the considerations that we will discuss in details just in a bit that we need to think about. Then it's not only that. As we said earlier, the way we think about risk assessment and safety in general, it is identity aware and it is trauma informed, meaning that we also take our psychological well-being and emotional readiness as something very crucial to the way we view risks. So we thought about physical preparation. Now let's think about emotional readiness and coverage plan. If I am someone, for example, how is my psychological well-being now? Have I been covering different protests back to back for a while now? Am I actually sleeping well? Am I eating well? Do I have specific things that I am aware of that will be triggers? For example, my relationship to the police has not been the best because of the work I was doing. So I knew for a while that police presence might make me very anxious and very feeling unsettled. So this is something that I am aware of when it comes to my emotional readiness doing this job. And it helps me because it helps me also create a mitigation plan. We're going to talk about that in a bit. Then when we talk about during, what do we need while on an assignment? Again, if I'm covering a convention or a polling station, what does situational awareness mean? What is my risk response? What is tactical safety? What do I actually view as risks that someone else might not view as risks? How do I think about my risk during an assignment if I am going on a reporting trip with another person? Does that change things or is it exactly the same? So these are some of the things that you need to think about. And then it doesn't end there. I went on an assignment, I covered the protest or I covered the polling station, and then now I'm done. Does the risk assessment or the managing risk stages end there? Nope, it does not actually. We still have one more stage that we need to think about, which is the after. And it is as important as we do before and during. A lot of us undermine how important this step is, but it's really, really important. Because in the after, you take point of a lot of things. First, you debrief. You think about like, well, I did all of these things to prepare. I did all of these things during the assignment. Let's think about what went well. What did not go as planned or as well as we hoped it to be? What else could have I done? And this is not to reminisce or to regret things. It's not at all. It's actually to learn from the things that we've done and build a better mitigation plan in the future. Another thing that we do in the after is that we rest, recover, and replenish. We need to take care of our both physical health and psychological well-being. How can we do that? It might differ from a person to another. Then how can we create a self-care plan specifically if this assignment has been hard and exhausting? And to start with the before, which is the pre-assessment planning, we're going to discuss some research, things to consider, risk assessment. We'll show you the complicated one that no one likes. And also we're going to show you a different way to do it that is more simple. And then we're going to talk about some of the preparations. And this is the framework, as I said, we're going to be applying the before, during, and after for every single thing, whether that's physical or psychological or anything like that, or like the digital for the next couple of sessions as well. So before you go on an assignment, what to research? Some of the things that you want to start with, location scouting. If you are able to go to a place beforehand, and experience this place, walk around, figure out exits, figure out nice coffee shop, figure out where you can find water and snacks, figure out place you can shelter. That would be wonderful. But we are all very aware that this might be a luxury that we're not all able to do. I might not be able to go to a place in advance and scout the location. But the good thing is there is a lot of digital things that we can use to help us do that. Technology can be used for good and bad, and we're going to see the different ways this is happening. But this is a very good thing to use technology for. You can use Google Maps, Google Earth, or Snap Map to actually show you how a location looks like. Where are the different alleys? If you want, like for example, if you're covering a protest, you definitely want to avoid small alleys that are ended up with a closed wall. Like you don't want to be stuck. So Google Maps and Google Earth and Snap Map can actually help you do that. So you can visit ahead of time, scope out, choke points, avoid choke points, see the good vantage points, parking, transit, exit routes. All of these things that you need to think about, whether in person, which would be ideal, if not, using different types of technology. And the other thing, honestly, it's not only about the risks. For example, when it comes to vantage points, if you are a photojournalist or a visual journalist, that might be a very good idea for you to plan ahead. Like, you know, this like elevated place will give you a better shot. So thinking about it, it doesn't have to be in a risk and mitigation way only, but it can also planning on how to get the better content that you want. Another thing, to research the power structures, and Jen will walk us through in so much details how to think about that, and from their wonderful experience covering different groups as well. But you need to understand what is the power structures in a specific location, whether that's military, police, politicians and political situation, racial, the attitude they have towards specific groups. And it depends on who you are. It depends on the layers of identities and intersectional identities that you hold. This is something that is extremely important for you. Then another thing is historical context and cultural known. Historical, like for that, it can be like for the physical spaces you'll be in, for the groups you'll be reporting alongside, for how your presence, the way you navigate the world itself, how will that be perceived and how will that affect your safety? And something else also to consider is that the relationship between the power structures with each other and with journalists. And that can also be helpful with historical context. For example, if I am going to this specific town to cover, I need to look up, for example, the relationship between the police and the journalists. Is there a history of violence? Is there a history of escalation? Similarly, with militant groups or anything like that, are they more friendly towards journalists or not? All of these considerations that you need to keep in mind and you need to research. Another thing as well is to make contact with organizers and locals who can help provide logistical information ahead of time. No one knows the place better than people who live there. They know like all of the small places, all of the places that you need to go to. They know more information about the actors in the place. So make sure to be in contact with people who are local as well. Now, how can we do an identity and trauma-informed risk assessment? The way we think about risk assessment or threat modeling is a general approach to three things. That's why I'm saying I know that the model is normally a lot of things, which would be ideal, but what we're trying to do is we want to identify our vulnerabilities. This is the most and first thing to do. Then we need to think through your security needs. So now I know my vulnerabilities. So now I need to think about my security needs to respond to these vulnerabilities. And the last thing is, how can I come up with a mitigation plan that suits my unique circumstances? So risk assessment, in very simple word, it helps us measure the risks and compare them or like against the editorial value of a given story we're doing. So we're measuring the risks. We are thinking about the needs for these risks and how can we mitigate them? Does that sound simple enough or complicated? Let me look at the chat if I'm missing anything. And Jen, please just jump in if I'm missing anything in chat as well. You can just jump in and okay. Nope, Jen is answering, so that's great. So the way we also view risk mitigation is like this. Think about the risk identification and actor mapping as the top one, which is so many things. As you can see, it's big, it's really big. But then we think about them, we identify them, and then we identify the actors that exist in that location. Then we start planning. When we start planning, it funnels down. It's less risky. Then when we start planning, we add security measures. The security measures should help us mitigate all of the risks that we are identifying. And something to remember here is that it is impossible to eliminate risks. What we are trying to do is to decrease the likelihood or the damage of these risks happening. So I wish I can tell you that like, oh, let's do this risk assessment and then we can eliminate all of the risks that exist. That would be wonderful, but this is not the reality. What we're trying to do is to decrease the likelihood and decrease the damage of these risks happening. So after we do security measures, we think about situational awareness in the field. If we have situational awareness, if we practice situational awareness, and I'm going to explain that later, how can this help us? Again, as you can see, it's decreasing the risks that we have identified earlier. Then when we put in place contingency plan and comms plan, this is also less and less risks. Jen, passing to you.
So these slides are kind of going to be basic risk assessment templates. So questions and the orders in which you can kind of like ask yourself these questions. So the first question that you kind of want to ask when you're thinking about what the issues are is who or what is at risk. Again, if we're taking an identity-based framework, we kind of want to acknowledge that not everybody is going to have the same risks or the same profiles. And in an ideal situation, you're not just taking care of yourself, but you're also taking care of the team around you, and you're looking out for your colleagues and coworkers. One of the folks had posted in the chat that their gear is regularly attacked by local anti-fascists and that they are sometimes like assaulted. That is, for example, that's a really clear example of like a risk to gear or a risk to equipment. I too have seen groups kind of like slash news van tires, but they'll be kind of like consistently, they'll attack the infrastructure. They won't necessarily attack the people all the time. So it's really important to know in your area, you know, are the groups that I'm dealing with more likely to attack things, or are they more likely attacked me, or are they more likely to attack people and infrastructure? So that's an example of when you're thinking about the who or what is at risk, you can kind of look to the past to see sort of like previous examples. The next thing that you're going to want to ask yourself in a risk assessment is what are the actual hazards, right? So does your police department have a history of doing location tracking and showing up at people's houses? Do local, election deniers have, for example, a history of doing digital smear campaigns on reporters? What are the actual things that could hurt you? And again, when we're going with an identity-based risk assessment, you might have two colleagues with different risk profiles that have completely different risks, which I'll get into a little bit more later. But so after you think through the hazards, the next thing you want to think through is these things called risk rating and consequences. So how risky is this? Am I just going to get yelled at, or is there like a serious threat of physical or lethal violence? Is someone just going to push my camera away from me, or are they going to put a screwdriver through the lens? How serious are the consequences? Would I have to buy new gear? Would I have to take weeks off of work? What are the real severities that I could be facing? However, because sometimes we can catastrophize or we can panic, it's also super important to think of the likelihood of these risks, right? Because I don't know about you guys, but I've been in situations and I've been panicking. I'm like, oh my God, there's going to be a mass shooting. There's going to be a mass shooting. There's going to be a mass shooting. And I'm so prepared with my like catastrophic gun wound kit and my tourniquet and everything that I forget to like bring my cell phone battery, because losing power is actually a way more likely risk. It's definitely going to happen than maybe necessarily there being a shooting at every single protest I attend, right? So especially in my early days when I was catastrophizing, it really helped me to actually think through the likelihood of things and to combine the risk rating and the consequence with that likelihood. These are things that can kind of help ground you and kind of help like calm you down a little bit. And then finally, after you've kind of thought through, okay, who's at risk? What are they at risk of? How likely it is to happen? And how severe would it be if it were to happen? Then you want to think of what can you do to mitigate it. So again, because we're combining it with the likelihood and the potential consequence, that also wants to inform, you know, how you bring your gear. Like, for example, if I'm going to a protest, I tend to keep my bulletproof vest and my catastrophic gun wound kit in the car, but I will always keep extra power bricks on me because my phone is definitely going to die. But usually I will have some sort of awareness that a protest is maybe escalating. And so I'll be able to kind of make choices, make choices to kind of mitigate that without having to kind of show up to every single protest dressed like Rambo in my full set of gear. So again, risk mitigation is kind of one of the most important skills that we really want you to take out of this, is what can you do ahead of time to prepare for whatever you're worried about happening on the ground on the day of. So yeah, we can go.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jen. I just want to ask people, like, how do you feel about the slide? I know some people have been sharing with us some of the things that they recommend we add. And I just want to say that, like, we're using some examples because, for example, me and Jen have worked together a lot, actually. And the way when we do risk assessment, their risk assessment might look very different than mine. And depending on where we're going or what we're doing, it might look the same with some differences. But it's very interesting. How do you feel about that? Does it seem overwhelming? Someone is asking, can we take notes and report on this on the record, post to social media? Yes, yes, for sure. This is recorded, as you can see, and it's going to be posted online. So please share with as many people as you can. That would be great. We want a lot of people to benefit from this.
Someone also asked for the slide on risk assessment template to who is at risk. I would suggest adding the press or the freedom of the press, since our actions can speak for the entire profession. And I do think that's really, really, really important. I think one of the things that I have seen, especially like through the Trump administration and through the sort of like fake news era, was every single journalist being held accountable for every single other journalist and being really viewed as a monolith. And that's something that I know I've had to spend a lot of time building relationships to sort of not be seen as that monolith. So I think that that's really important, actually, to think about how your actions will also affect other journalists. That's a really good point to bring up.
We can also make sure to post this example, this risk assessment template somewhere as resources for you to find as well. Someone is asking for more examples from Jen or me or the audience. We're very happy to, for sure. Yes. Can you talk about doing these assessments on the fly during breaking news, imagining a Jan 6 type scenario, or covering a country election board meeting that turns into a contentious or hostile environment? This is a wonderful, wonderful question. And the thing is, remember let me go back actually to that slide. Remember when I said the three main things that we want to think about when we do risk assessment? Ideally, is that table that we just had. But I know that sometimes if I have a breaking news story, I might have to leave in like 5 minutes. If we think about quickly the vulnerabilities, the security needs, and how to mitigate them, the more we practice it, the more this will take 5 minutes from you at the end. And if you do it more and more, it will become like a habit for you. It will be like your thinking process about any type of assignment. My hope is that a risk assessment can be done for every single assignment that you have. If this is the case, and if you apply it and practice it over and over and over, it really becomes your habit. Like, for example, if you're leaving your apartment, you don't necessarily think about it in like as a to-do list, but you check your oven. You check that if you were ironing, I hate ironing, but like if you were ironing clothes, you check that the iron is not really plugged, right? Then you check that you have your keys and the door is closed. At the beginning, maybe you think about these things like in steps. It's like, this is my to-do list to think about before I leave my house. But then it becomes a habit for you. It becomes something that you do unconsciously. And this is what we're really, really hoping for. We're hoping that when you ask these questions, it becomes something that you implement in every assignment without them taking too much time from you. And again, back to the basics of risk and mitigation. There are two key components of risk, as Jen mentioned as well last slide, the likelihood and the impact. The likelihood is how exposed you are to the hazard that you identified, and how likely is it to happen. And the other part of it is the impact. What would be the consequences if something happened? And what we mean by mitigation, again, your great answers early in the session, mitigations are the measures that decrease the likelihood of a risk or decrease the severity of its impact if it happens. So again, think about these two things, likelihood and impact. Mitigation is how to decrease this or this, actually. It's as simple as that. Just keep that in mind and write them for yourself now. And try to ask yourself, maybe every day if you're doing an assignment, about any random assignment. What would be the likelihood? What would be the impact? And how can I mitigate it? And you will find that some of these things can be applied in different assignments the same way. It might differ depending how radical the change is in the story or the location, but some of them can actually be implemented in a similar way. This is one of my favorite slides because I would never do any of that, whether with or without the safety things that they have. But we always keep talking about inherent risk and residual risk. On the left, the inherent risk is the person doing this wonderful thing that I would never do with no security measures, just hanging from a mountain and not looking terrified, but it's very risky. The likelihood of something happening is way, way, way more than what is on the right side. So the inherent risk is the danger that you have here, as you can see. What happens is when we apply security measures, in this case, the rope, the things that they tie and all of that, then you are left with residual risk, which is way fewer and way less than what you have when you started with. Now, to pass it to Jen.
So the next thing that we're going to talk about is sort of considerations for when is a risk assessment necessary. And to ideal situation, you would do a risk assessment before every single dangerous thing that you do, or single thing that you do, because, you know, as we've been seeing, things like school board meetings or things that are maybe not, you know, you wouldn't inherently think are quote dangerous, have become these sites of sort of conflict. Right. So ultimately, it is preferable to do a risk assignment before every assignment, or at least to kind of be having this running in the background of your brain all of the time. So, but you know, if we're strapped for resources, I'm going to go over a couple of times when it's really important to do this. It's really important to do this with not just by yourself, but with your team. So with other reporters that you're working with, and then also with your editor or the people that you're reporting to, and also potentially the people that you know, you're able to petition to get resources from. If you do a risk assessment and you realize that, you know, you really need a bulletproof vest, it's really important to bring this to bring this conversation to the people that can get you that bulletproof vest, for example. Another reason that this is important to do with your team is that so that everyone can kind of have a good understanding of everyone's risk tolerance and also everyone's different risks. For me, and I've worked with a lot of reporters who don't look like me or who don't have the same background as me. And when having these conversations, I realize that things that maybe I think are neutral are actually dangerous to other people. So this is one of the reasons that you want to constantly bring these conversations up with your team, is because you could learn things that you don't know about threat, and also learn things that you don't know about what's threatening others, and also kind of come to agreements, right? So for example, I'm someone who doesn't particularly mind being around tear gas or pepper spray, but if I, for example, have a colleague who is pregnant and we know that tear gas can act as an abortifacient, or it can, you know, cause really serious reproductive issues to people, they're not going to want to be around tear gas. So it would make sense for us to say, hey, if the tear gas comes out, I have to leave. And then I can say, okay, cool. If you have to leave, I could, you know, should I either stay covering it by myself? What can we do in that case? Or should I leave with you? And then we can talk to our editor about, you know, what do we do if that situation happens? right? So it's really important to, when you're doing these risk assessments, to do them kind of collectively so that you guys can, again, do that mitigation plan in order to do the mitigation plan in order to basically have your actions kind of pre-decided, so that you don't have to be panicking, worried, maybe getting tear gassed or getting crowd crushed, and then, trying to negotiate what your risk tolerance is. So you want to do that beforehand. Another thing that you really want to make sure of is that the communication channels are open, and you want to do this ahead of time. So you want to make sure that everyone in your group is open to talking about this stuff ahead of time, because you don't want to get into a situation that you're scared or you're freaked out, and your colleague is patting you saying, don't be cowardly, or the other way around. You don't want to be saying that to your colleague. So this stuff is really important to bring up ahead of time to make sure that this dialogue and this conversation is open so that you can set boundaries and be comfortable with each other. Another thing is that it is also super important, if you can't have these every single time with your newsroom, you at least want to make sure that you do this every single time you're in a new type of assignment, a new location, or you're with a new type of team. Because that is when you kind of just want to like set these boundaries from the beginning. Another time that this stuff is really, really critical is that you want to reassess these risk assessments after any type of serious violent event or any type of political moment, or when they're known to be known online or personal threats. So these types of key moments, say for example, America, I'm trying to, I don't want to like give too bad of an example, but we did witness an escalation of journalists getting shot at by rubber bullets after 2020, right? So when 2020 was happening, there were initially some reports of, journalists were getting their eyes shot out, for example, with rubber bullets. If that is something that you see happening, but maybe your local protest hasn't popped off yet, you're going to want to go to the newsroom and say, hey, we're starting to see instances of people getting shot at by rubber bullets. How do we want to identify as press? Do we want to change our profile? Do we want to wear our press badge? What do we do, and how do we assess ourselves, assess the situation, given that new violence has kind of come to be on the horizon? Someone in the chat asked if, should we wear our press vest? How do we identify that? That is kind of a conversation that you and your newsroom need to have, because, for example, some newsrooms have really strict rules about saying, no, you need to be identified as press. It needs to be clear. And that's for their sort of their own transparency standards. Whereas if you're freelance, you may, for example, have more leeway to kind of blend in as a protester. One of our colleagues, she will intentionally go to events and photograph them in plain clothes with her phone, so she does not draw attention to herself as press. But that's something that she has like had conversations with people, she's an independent artist, and B, she's had conversations with folks that she works for about her profile and her safety. So those questions about when do I wear the press vest, or when do I wear these things, these are the type of conversations that happen when you're in conversation with your newsroom and when you're aware of what threats are really happening to you. A kind of basic thing that might be helpful for some folks for this particular example is there is safety in numbers, and there tends to be safety in daylight, and there tends to be safety in cities that have a lot of press. The most respect I've ever been treated by the police was when I was in Washington, D.C. during the daylight wearing my press badge. And then the times it's been harder has been when I've been alone at night. So I think if you kind of think about, the police are more likely to attack journalists when they're isolated. Activists are more likely to attack journalists if they don't know you. And yeah, these are some examples. I don't want to go too deep into it because we'll go kind of into actor mapping later, but that had just come up in the chat. But TLDR, whenever you see kind of an escalation of violence or a new or added threat, these are especially clear moments to have these conversations about risk assessment in your office or in your team, because these are the moments when the material conditions have changed and thus new risks are on the horizon. And so that's the best time to talk about new things. Another thing when you're having these conversations is what resources are you going to need to handle them? You know, if, for example, your newsroom says, hey, having a high profile, being really visibly pressed is getting us beat up constantly, you might need a smaller camera. You might need to be shooting on your iPhone. You might need to get, you know, they make little lens attachments for your iPhone that you can use. You might want to have your conversation with your newsroom about that. Or how do we have a digital social media sound kit that I can use instead of the dead cat and the boom? You know, there's, you know, part of this risk assessment is also making sure that you have the gear that you need to do the job that you have to do. Another big question to ask that's really important is who owns the risk? So who takes responsibility for it? For example, if you get arrested, is your newsroom going to bail you out and have your legal support? Or are you going to have to rely on your own funds, your family, your local bail fund, etc.? Okay, let's see if any other questions came up in the chat. And Jeje, if you want to co-answer with me. Oh, the big question of, do you have any advice for journalists working in newsrooms that don't want to engage in safety conversations?
Yes, this is why we're doing this, because we're really hoping. So one of the things about safety, and Jen mentioned that earlier as well, is that we really want to change the culture around the conversations of safety, whether that's physical, whether that's digital or psychological. The conversation around safety have shifted a lot in the last like 15 to 20 years. The physical safety aspect of it have been considered more serious and more understood as a risk, but only in specific things, if someone is covering conflict or war. So that was the concept about it. Now it's shifting because almost anyone, anywhere in the universe now in the world will face risks while doing their job as a journalist. So the definition of physical risks and how serious it is has shifted. The conversation around digital, for example, have shifted a lot in the last 5 to 7 years. Before, it wasn't taken seriously. It wasn't considered an actual risk. Now, we're very grateful and thankful that the conversation is shifting to become more and more taken seriously by newsrooms. But one of the things that we're trying to do is, other than that we want as many journalists and freelancers to have access to this information, is that the more we have these conversations, the more it is possible for us to change the culture around safety and security when it comes to journalism. So have these conversations more and more and more. And if you want, a lot of the organizations here in the room, CPJ, IWMF, or PEN America, all of us are working on safety in different ways, and we work with newsrooms. So please feel free to reach out to us as well. And let's see how we can support you in these conversations.
Really quick. Also, to add to that, I think I think like if the newsroom in general doesn't want to talk about these things, you can kind of, I was given this advice at a different conference where you can kind of organize basically locally, right? So it's like you and your reporter are going to have this conversation, and then, or like you and your cameraman are going to have this conversation, and then it's you, your cameraman, and your editor, and then you find out how well that works, and then you can bring it to your next team. And if you kind of organize this, this is advice I was given by another safety person. If you can kind of do it the way that you would a union, where you kind of build the on the ground power first, where all the reporters are saying, hey, we're doing this safety stuff is really important, and then elevate it, that can be a more kind of effective way of getting the higher ranked people to listen. Again, safety numbers, strength in numbers. And then again, having these conversations about safety or bringing it back to like, hey, we cannot deliver you good product if we are in danger. Those are maybe a couple lines that might be able to help. I hope that helps. Sorry. Go back to you, Jeje.
Yeah, thank you so much. Another thing also is someone is asking in a job interview or starting a contract as a freelancer, is it appropriate to ask, what is your newsroom safety policy? Is there a standard in the industry for safety principles? So as I said, all of the organizations that are here today work with newsrooms and work on making safety and security more accessible and better in the industry. So there is a lot of resources that we will make sure to share with you or add to the landing page where you can check. Another thing as well is that a culture of safety, ACOS, has a lot of these resources and set of principles for safety specifically for freelance journalists. So please make sure to check them out. And if someone can send them to to everyone in the room, that would be also helpful for freelancers to view. Thank you so much. Now, Jen mentioned a lot of amazing things and important things to think about when it comes to risk and risk assessment and thinking about safety. Another thing that we want to consider as well is, what is my personal profile? And someone asked in the chat, when do I identify as a journalist, and all of these things. The way we think about how we exist and navigate the world when it comes to being a journalist and to our safety is that we think about identity, profile, and then situation. Identity is mainly how I see myself, how I consider myself, whether that's gender, whether that's sexuality, race, color, nationality, ethnicity, like all of these things. My role actually also can be something that is considered in my identity. My physical and mental health, what am I able to do? How can I navigate a risk if it arises? That's how I see myself. This is my identity. But then there is something called profile. And this doesn't necessarily always align with your identity. A profile is how others see me. So how I am perceived in the world around me. And this sometimes aligns with my identity and other times does not. It's more about generalization and all of these things that we have and preconceived notions about people. So these are two things that you need to think about. And then we have the situation where I fit into my team and the wider culture and the political context. So these are three different things that you can think about. And you can think about this personal profile through the list that we have here and add more if it's not necessarily existing on this slide. So who am I? How do I identify? What is my identity? How is my profile? How others see me? If I am a Black woman that is an immigrant going to cover a specific thing, a specific story in a small town that is not necessarily known to be friendly to people like me. So my profile in that situation will be very different. And I need to think about that, and I need to consider that for my own safety. Then the situation, where do I fit into my team? Am I going to go report with Jen, for example? How are we going to do the risk assessment, Jen? Like if me and you go report in a small town, how my safety or my profile and Jen's profile would interact with each other in that given situation. How does my profile and my identity fit into the wider culture of that location? And what is the political context there? How will that affect my own security and my safety? So every person has different identities that can be something that is extremely, extremely good for them and help them actually have more access, can be very good for them to cover a specific story, give them access that no one else can actually get, but it can also be a vulnerability. And I just want to make sure that this is, I had to highlight this, that your identity is not something that will make you less good at something. It's just something that you need to think about in a way that is, what is my vulnerability in a specific situation and what are my strengths? Because identity is both. It can be a vulnerability in a specific situation and it can be a wonderful, wonderful strength in other. So we just want to make sure that this is something we keep in mind when we're doing our risk assessment. Now, which elements of your identity or your profile and your situation on an assignment impact your safety? This is a question for you. You've been engaging with us in a very wonderful way, so please keep it going. And we'll give you like a couple of seconds to answer this question. And again, we'll share some of the answers without attribution, so feel free to do that.
One thing that I want to add is that part of your profile is also who you love and who you care about. So that might be something that, you know, if someone looks at me, they might not automatically think who I care about or who I love, right? So I've had situations where someone will come to me and will say maybe hateful or bigoted things. And because they don't know that I have the community that I do. And so I think also when we're analyzing our profile, it is also, you know, what could someone say to you not knowing who you really are? And how am I going to maybe preemptively do the psychosocial work to prepare myself for that? Does that make any sense? So
And we
I
have actually, sorry, Jen.
go ahead. There you go.
No, I was going to say we have actually also some answers in the chat. Someone said physical disability is something that impacts their safety. Someone said their gender, that the environment they work in has a strong patriarchal setting, and so being a female journalist is very sticky in the area I work in. So these are some of the considerations for some people. Perfect. Let's continue, and then I will share more answers as well with everyone. Now, when we think about risk management, we think about it through an intersectional lens. There is the individual aspect to it, there is the organizational aspect to it, and then there is the operational context for it. And that you can use this specific way to think about risk for whatever location you're in. For individual, we already mentioned that, like age, gender, citizenship, previous experience, ability, physical and mental health, marital status, sexual orientation, family status, sex, race, education, and all of these things affect how we think about risk and risk management. Then we have the organizational context. And what we mean by that is, what is my beat? The desk I work on, the medium. Can someone tell me why the medium matters? And why the beat matters, actually, when we think about risk? Aren't we all just journalists? Or what is the difference between the type of medium that I use? I'll give it a couple of more seconds. The exposure you have. Nice, exactly, the exposure you have. Some people's equipment is more visible or fragile. Yes. Photographers are more likely to get attacked since they need to be in the field. A reporter can phone it in. So your beat and your medium definitely affects, or like in a way plays a role in your risk and risk management. Again, as all of you said, the profile, the visibility, the equipment that you have. Me going on a field with my iPhone is different than me going on a field with a big camera with 3 different lenses as well. So that's something to think about. The beat, if you cover, or desk, if you cover politics, if you cover sports, if you cover all of these things, it's different from the risk level. And also like the period where the risk is higher. Like for example, for sports, around specific big sports events, the risk to journalists might be higher. For the political desk, it can be more around elections. So thinking about that and how your risk might shift throughout the year is something that is very important. TV crews might attract more attention because we're obviously news. Amazing, yes.
Another thing I want to add about beats is being a beat reporter can also keep you safer because then you know people better and you're investing kind of more time into to potentially, making relationships that can keep you safer. Like for example, like I said, I cover a lot of protests. So in pretty much any city that I go to, I can plug in pretty quickly with an activist community. And then because I'm sort of what's called like vetted, I'm less likely to get violence done against me because people know me. They're like, oh, we know her, they're cool. Or, again, if you're in the beat or you're covering something consistently, then people might know who you are from online exposure, just from reading your work. So also with beats is also about relationship building. And so, I've found that some of my friends who maybe have to drop into communities or drop into protests or drop into topics have less awareness or expertise than some of my beat reporter friends, and thus can be at more risk because, it's they don't have that vetting or they don't have that awareness from the community of who they already are. One thing I'll talk this a little bit about more soon, but the best way to make relationships with groups is beforehand, not in the moment of conflict. So we'll talk about that later, but that's one thing I wanted to add about beats.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jen. That's very, very important to have in mind. Again, some of the operational context, the national laws, the legal protections that you have or don't have, the local cultural attitudes, specifically around the press and gender and who you are as a person, the infrastructure, environment, weather, treaties, all of these things we're going to be talking about in a minute.
So actor mapping personally is one of the most interesting parts of the risk assessment process. Actor mapping is, of course, something that changes. keeping notes of threat actors is like reporting a beat unto itself. Who the threat actors are and what risks engaging them may come with is quite related to your identity and your profile, especially for the US election cycle. For example, I'm someone who is small, I'm white, I look younger than I am, I'm feminine presenting, but I'm a punk style and I have like a bunch of tattoos you can't really see, but I am like super tatted. I actually tend to have a lot of luck interacting with extremist groups, and they, for whatever reason, they really tend to like me. That is not the case for all of my colleagues, but I've found that, you know, for me personally, because I kind of like look non-threatening, but then also have an edge to me, that's something that like gets me in with a lot of groups. And that can be something that gives me, like, you know, we talk about how identity can also give you advantages. You know, if I'm covering a political, like a political debate or something, I have to cover up all my tattoos. I have to get really clean cut. But in maybe more dangerous situations, my identity or my presentation can actually help me. So, however, but because I have, on the flip side of that, because I have a more distinct look, if I have a stalker or if I have a troll or if I have someone that's targeting me, that might put me at more risk because I'm very visible, right? And I'm pretty easy to identify. Like there's not a lot of people in the crowd that has, you know, hair that looks like a flame, right? Or, you know, a big, like big tattoos that I do. So again, as you're doing these actor mappings, you also want to reflect on how they interact with your profile, right? So as you're doing your actor mapping and your consideration, here's a few things that you need to research. The different groups or different actors that will be present in the place or the event that you're covering. So who is likely to show up that day? If you are doing, in your town, do you have more groups that kind of go to every protest, or in your town or in your area, do you have groups that kind of just show up to certain protests, right? There are some communities, for example, where everyone shows up to everything. So it's going to be the same group of people kind of no matter what the issue is. And there are some protests that maybe bring out people who don't protest, you know. I saw, yeah. So who's going to be there? And who's going to be there is question number one. The next thing is you want to look at is what are the power dynamics and relationships? And I don't just mean this just in relationship to the press, although that is super important, but also to each other. Because one of the things you don't want to do necessarily is get in between groups that are fighting, or you don't want to, you know, talk to one person who's in a group and then go talk to someone else who hates that group. And then, you know, because they might get mad at you, oh, I'll call you a snitch, get you in trouble, something like that. So you want to know how the groups relate to each other. A couple questions that might help you think about this is, for example, are your local paramilitary groups pro-law enforcement or against law enforcement? One way you can look to this is if the paramilitary groups have a Blue Lives Matter flag on or an American flag on, they're probably comfortable with law enforcement. But if they have, you know, if they don't have that, or if they have other symbols like the anti-fascist symbol, the 3 arrows, they're probably against law enforcement. Another question you could potentially ask yourself is, did law enforcement work with, arrest, or assault journalists in your area in 2020? That's something that you kind of want to know, what's the relationship between the press and the law enforcement. Have there been any major legal cases for police brutality against activists lately? So if there have been kind of high-profile arrests or high-profile brutality cases between the police and activists, or police and protesters, that's going to maybe tell you a little bit about the relationship between the law enforcement and the protesters. Do paramilitary groups have a history of violence at your rallies, or are they more specifically community defense? In the next slide, I'll get a little bit into the militia situation, but in some places, you'll see people out there with guns, but they're really just trying to defend things. They're not coming out to be super offensive. They're not, you know, waving their guns in people's faces necessarily. And again, the more that you know the actors in your area and the more you understand them, the more you can kind of better risk assess, you know, is this person with the gun going to shoot someone, or is this person with the gun praying that he doesn't actually have to use his gun today, right? These are meaningful differences when we're analyzing threat actors.
I want to add one thing
go
before you continue. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to add one thing, is that when we talk about extremist groups in general, and any of the groups that we're discussing now, one of the things that we think about is not necessarily affiliation, but we think about the history, that if they have history of violence and if they have prediction of likelihood of potential violence as well in the future. There are many resources that you can look up that will help you think through that. So just think about, in a specific location, if these groups, what are the groups that had a history of escalation and violence towards journalists or activists or the police? Because something that is directed towards you as a journalist, but others are directed, or like the risk for you would be if you're caught up, as Jen mentioned earlier, if you're caught up in a situation between two different groups. So it's important to think about the history, but also there are so many organizations that study extremist groups or militias in general and paramilitaries, and they study the likelihood of escalation in the coming couple of years or in the coming elections. So checking these resources is very, very important for you to make your own decisions about how do I feel going to a specific protest, for example. Sorry, Jen, please continue.
Oh no, and I'll wrap this up real quick so we can get to the next one. Another thing that is just, I think, really important in threat actor mapping is analyzing why they don't like the press, right? Some groups are pretty obvious about they don't like the press because press getting photographed for them poses a safety risk to them, versus some people don't like the press because they don't like democracy, or they don't want democracy, or they, there's so many reasons why people don't like the press or why people might be hostile to the press. And the more you can understand that, the better you can know to approach folks, right? So when I reported on Standing Rock, a lot of Indigenous folks are skeptical of the press because of a long history of racism in the press. And so I was able to not entirely overcome that ever, but was able to still get a lot of really strong interviews by proving I was trustworthy and by sticking around. If we want to move to the next slide real quick, we can kind of talk specifically about militia activity, which I know is something that people think about a lot. So one thing I want to say about militias is that militias kind of militias is a very specific legal definition for a group of armed citizens who basically replace the role of the police or emergency services in their town. You don't have militias everywhere across the United States, but you have armed groups across the United States, right? So one of the things that, when you're looking into the history of your region, you kind of want to look into, again, the history of militias, right? Are they groups that, for example, are constitutional militias that are descended from like Revolutionary War people? Groups like that tend to have more first aid training. They tend to be kind of in a position of power in the community. Are these militias that are kind of like more out on the West Coast, for example, that are, maybe birthed in a lot of really bloody violence? Are they border militias? We've seen a lot of border militias whose kind of chief goal is to pick people up who are crossing the border and turn them over to Border Patrol, and they are actively working with law enforcement. So again, you kind of want to know, are these groups working with law enforcement? Are they against law enforcement? These are really important, again, so you don't get caught in the crossfire. Another thing that I want to acknowledge is that we've seen a pretty significant rise in leftist armed groups over the past few years. Most notably, pretty recently, there's been a lot of groups who are armed protecting drag shows. That is, remember how I said before, there's groups of people who have guns but really don't want to use it. These people who are doing community events for marginalized communities, they tend to really not ever want to have to fire their gun. They're just afraid for their lives. So they are trying to protect people from being killed. Understanding that history can help you kind of interact with them. A lot of folks are not going to be willing to talk to press at all day of, anything maybe more than a word. But one of the things that you can do is, if you're embedded in an area or you're kind of like connected to a beat, you can kind of learn about the local cultures. You can kind of try to make relationships. People in general, trauma brain does not necessarily, or, active defense brain does not necessarily want to engage new people and can be very protective. However, if you build long-term relationships with groups or people, and kind of catch people when they're more relaxed, they might be more likely to open up with you about these situations. Particularly, okay. So we're running short on time, so I can move to the next slide. If there's any questions about the next 3 slides, throw them in the chat and I will answer them after I'm done talking. So the next thing I want to acknowledge is medical risk. The reality of the situation is in states with abortion bans, we have seen a loss of medical personnel, right? So people are not coming down to work in these states as doctors, and they're also leaving the states, or they're not applying to residency. So in states that have abortion bans, not only are pregnant people more at risk of not being able to access medical care, but everyone is more at risk of not being able to access medical care because this can create staffing in hospitals. Obviously, departments like OBGYN are more in danger of being understaffed. But this is just something that's worth noting, because if you are injured in one of these states, you kind of want to have already done your research about the medical resources and figure out what are the best hospitals, what are the safest hospitals, what are the best staffed hospitals that I can access. So that I can stay safe if I am hurt in a place that's having medical issues. So sorry, I'm talking so fast about this just for time.
No,
I
that's
hope this
totally
makes
fine.
sense.
I think one thing also to think about when it comes to medical is that how long it will take an ambulance to reach you if you need one. So you can actually look up this average time and number of minutes or so, depending on the place that you're going to, so that you can know and prepare accordingly. We will move a little bit faster because we're almost out of time.
And so another risk that has really popped up since the 2020 elections has been an extreme elevation of anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ sentiments. This is something that, again, as we're talking about identity-aware profile building, we want to be aware of not just, what your identity is, but also how you're perceived of by others. I, for example, am LGBTQ and non-binary, but I'm not clocked as one all the time. I have friends who are straight, who are clocked as queer. So in some weird ways, they might be more at risk than me. On a legal level, a number of states have passed what's called bathroom bans. So if you are a queer or trans person and you are, or you are perceived of, again, as a queer or trans person, and you are using a bathroom that does not align with someone thinks you should be using with your sex assigned at birth, you might be put into jail. You might be arrested, detained, or put into jail. These situations are going so far as queer and trans communities are creating self-defense scenarios to get themselves to prepare for this. So these are real risks in these states. Other things that you might, if also you are arrested or jailed in any of these states, you will be put in the cell that aligns with your sex assigned at birth or the sex that's on your driver's license, which it's not always the same, but the basically like the sex that they can find for you. So that could increase risk. So for example, if you have a trans colleague who is arrested, who is placed in a jail cell, that might be that might be someone that you want to bail out sooner. That might be someone that you want to make sure is safe very, very quickly, just in case someone is arrested. In these states, you're also more likely to find harassment, threats of violence, but the flip side to it, again, because your identity is strong, if you are a queer journalist, if you are an LGBTQ journalist, communities in these states, in my experience, have been extremely eager to have competent coverage. So though, the maybe general public life might be a little bit more dangerous than it was before, you can get really powerful, really strong pieces out because those communities will be very welcoming to you.
I want to answer a couple of questions quickly before we move on to the next slide. Couple of questions. One of them was someone asking for a slide showing different kinds of law enforcement might be a good idea. I think we can think about that and see if we can provide it as a follow-up resource. Another question, what does abortion have to do with the safety concerns? Location is certainly a concern, distance from medical facilities. To answer this one, the first concern is that if the person is pregnant, this is a very big concern in case they get into a medical emergency, and how the state and the laws there will affect the likelihood of supporting them and providing medical care needed at the moment. And the second thing is that because of the restrictive laws that have been going around the country, a lot of medical doctors and new residents have been refusing to go to specific states and cities, which is causing medical shortage in these places, which in turn will affect if you will be able to receive medical care how fast and like how specific your medical care or comprehensive it will be. I want to move on because we're almost out of time. And some of the things we're going to talk about here is that preparation and mitigation when it comes to risk assessment. Again, self-and profile, already covered that. Communication. What is the type of communication and the method of communication we will be using? What if the communication signal have been jammed? How can I reach my colleagues? Am I using a communication method that is secure and encrypted? Who am I communicating with, and how often is this communication going to be? Am I going to have a check-in system, which is like, for example, I will be texting Jen, or I'm going to be, let's see that Nadine will be the editor. So am I going to be reaching out to Nadine every 30 minutes just to check in and see that like, hey, good, everything is fine? What happens? What is the protocol if Nadine didn't hear from me for like an hour or an hour and a half? What are the things that we need to do? Then me and Jen, we're going to the field together. So we need to agree in case we're separated. Where are our meeting points? Not only one meeting point. So 1, 2, 3. So for example, me and Jen are going to agree that we're going to go to this specific building or this specific coffee shop or whatever it is after, if we get separated in like maybe an hour. So if this location is compromised and we can no longer go there, what is the second location that we need to meet at? Transportation. What am I using? Am I using a car? That means if it's my car, how visible is this car? Is it necessarily a car that is used a lot in this location? Or is it going to be too visible and will make my profile high? Also, what does that mean for my license? Like if there are license scanners and like someone can know a lot about my life and my information and where I live from that license. So maybe in this specific situation, an Uber would be better. Or like a bus, whatever it is, it might be better than a car. But this, again, it's not a one size fits all. You need to think about your own risk assessment and how this scenario or how this story will affect your risk. Then what type of personal protective equipment do I need? Is there a likelihood of the use of tear gas? Is there a likelihood of, and also like if this is a case and I have asthma, how do I think about my own safety then, or my own medical health? What can I pack with me? And also, what I pack with me might affect how fast I go, how fast I run if I need to run. So these are things to consider and keep in mind. Do I have insurance? What does my insurance cover? Is it insurance for my medical stuff, or is it insurance also for my equipment? Thinking about all of these things is important. My legal rights, even, for example, if I'm arrested, what's going to happen? Is there someone that can bail me? Is there a specific lawyer that I can reach out to, or an organization like RCFP that can provide, for example, free legal support? My digital security, can people find all of my information online quickly and easily, or did I do a proper preparation early on and hid some of this information and deleted some of them? Your support, your family, your friends, how can I recover after a specific assignment? Your boundaries. If you feel something is wrong, most probably something is wrong. Really trust your gut. If I am in a location and I feel like, like these tingly things and I'm like, something is off, I will trust my gut. I will trust my gut that I'm feeling something is off, something might be happening. What are the things to bring and what are my contingency plans? These are the last ones for physical. Now let's think about our mental health. Do I have any vulnerabilities that need attending to or that make this project challenging, whether that's physical or mental, but that we need to think about pre-assignment? Plan out your assignment, the work that you need to do, the content, the locations, and the goals. I need to get like minimum, for example, I need to get 3-4 photos and 1 video. Or I need to interview 2 people for this specific story. So this is the minimum of what I need to do so that if things happen, I can actually just leave and I don't stay in a location more than I need to. What is my self-care system? Do I have breaks? Do I take breaks? Do I exercise normally, rest? Have I slept well? And coping ahead, anticipating hotspots is something very, very crucial for your mental health. Now, another things to think about to bring with you during for the assignment. Do you have the key contacts available? Press pass, government ID, your appropriate clothing, layers. In case you're jailed, you have layers because the jail normally is colder. So do you have layers with you? Communication or tracking devices, your first aid or medical kit if needed. personal protective equipment, work-related equipment. Do you have extra batteries, extra lenses, all of these things, recorder, copy of emergency contact, printed and saved somewhere that you can reach, in your shoes, anything, anywhere like that, that you can actually have them printed and with you. And of course, currency, cash, and cards.
So in communication, we basically want to talk about what devices are you going to bring and kind of what are the risks to that. One of the things that we kind of want to clarify is that surveillance is one of the biggest risks that we're seeing with cell phones. So things like, I would invite you to come to our digital security session specifically, but things like turning off your location tracker, knowing that basically knowing that if you post live photos, people can find you, right? Like people use this technology skill set called geolocation to figure out where you are. So if you're live tweeting or you're live posting an event and you have threats against you, someone would be able to find you and potentially show up. So that's something with communication that you kind of want to be aware of when you're thinking about communication and devices. But basically with communication, it's just, how are you going to stay in touch with the people in your newsroom? And what are you going to do if the communication systems fail? So that's something. Are you going to have a rendezvous point? Are you going to have a meetup point? What do you do if you miss check-ins? Do you have an emergency contact? Things like that are super important. So if you want to go to the next slide, we're kind of at a crunch for time. So Jeje, what do you think we want to do? Do we want to kind of run through these? I can do a quick thing about the after if you want me to, and then we can.
I think so. I think so. We mentioned already transportation, some considerations about like how high profile your car is, what type of vehicle you need. Do you need like to get your car, again, the license? What do you need in your car? Things, again, what to bring with you, medical supplies, water, blanket, all of these basic that you might need. And how like do you need, how do you consider your changing routes? Do you want to take the same route again and again? That will affect your profile as well, and someone can be following you. So I want to skip to making a safety plan quickly. And again, nothing new here. It's exactly what we discussed earlier. It's just more details. Please make sure to take a picture of this, and we will also make sure to post it with the resources. Again, who will be doing what? Who is in the assignment? Who am I going with? Who am I communicating with? Who is on call? Nadine is my editor, so I'm going to go to Nadine. Jen is my colleague that I'm reporting with. So these are the people involved. Where? Where am I going? Is it a small city? How many hotels in this city? Because that will affect my profile. If it's only one hotel, then most probably people from outside this town might be staying there. So in specific situations, I might prefer to actually drive 20 or 30 minutes further and stay in another location so that it's not known where I'm staying. Why am I there? Again, the minimum amount of content that you need to achieve your story. What is happening, or what is the equipment I have? What do I need to keep myself and my team safe? What equipment do you need to take with you, and what can you actually not have if you don't need them? And when was the last time I rested? That will affect my judgment, my risk planning, my risk assessment. And also, when is the time to leave? And how can I communicate with Jen as we're reporting together that this is the time to leave now? During the assignments, Jen, do you want to go over quickly?
Oh yeah. So during the assignment is kind of we do these risk assessments so that we can have the smoothest possible assignment, right? So most of risk assessment planning is pre-work, right? So once you've gotten to the assignment, you want to know, you want to like focus on the task at hand. You want to basically just allow all of this preparation that you've done to serve you. So one of the things that's worth noting is these risk assessments, though, however, are not set in stone. You can be the best oracle and the best predictor at world, and unexpected things can still happen. So this is why things like establishing communication, having these open dialogues with your colleagues. If you do this pre-work before and then something changes while you're on the ground, you're going to be able to be more mobile, and you're going to be able to be more kind of like responsive. If you already know the person has certain fears of certain threat actors from a different assignment, and then those threat actors show up unexpected, you're going to already know that you're going to need to leave, or you're going to need to be protected from that. So while you're doing this, just make sure that you stay focused and allow all of this pre-work to serve you. So finally, we're going to rush quick to the post assignment. And as an editor and as someone who has mentored students, the post assignment is my personal favorite part of this. Because one of the things that this is one of the ways that you really secure serious, like real bonds in your newsroom. Every time I would send a reporter out, I would have them call me when they got out, and I would make sure they were safe. I would have them talk through. What happened to me, so they can kind of A, work on their story, and B, sort of begin the processing of the day. I would ask them how they handled it. I would ask them to recount the main events. I would ask if they were overwhelmed. I would let them talk out the day. And again, I would really allow them to process it, because processing this event in the postmortem is going to cut down on some of your psychosocial risks. Because again, so much of trauma is about things that are unprocessed in the brain, that the more we can kind of do right away triage processing of everything that happens, the less psychosocial risks we're going to have, essentially. So another thing that can be really helpful in your kind of like post-mortem is asking if there's anything that you wish you had done differently, or any equipment that you'd wished you have. Then you can start making your mental gear list, making kind of like additions for your next assignment. Next, we need to make sure how we're going to finish the assignment. So, is this a turnaround that is in 2 hours? Is this a turnaround that we have about a week to finish? But again, talking about and processing these things can kind of like help you also come up with your story, because as you talk, you're going to hear, oh, that really was a big part of the day. I really did notice that. And it'll help you kind of pull out beats for your storytelling. And finally, one thing that I did with all of my students and everyone that I mentor and everyone that I always edit for is I always ask at the end of the conversation, okay, after we get off this call, what are you going to do to take care of yourself? Are you going to put on music you like? Are you going to have a good meal? Are you going to go play with your dog? What are you going to do to make sure that you come out of this in good spirits and in a good mood, and not overburdened by the stress of the day? Again, this is good for mitigating psychosocial risks, because it shows that someone is supporting you, someone is looking after you, and that it can also form a cohesion in your team that will make you more resilient for future assignments.
Thank you so much, Jen. And thank you, everyone. I know we ran 2 minutes longer than we should, but thank you so much. We had a lot of wonderful questions that we wanted to make sure to answer. I want to pass it to Nadine to close us off.
Thank you. Thank you both. I hope that this has been a really incredible learning opportunity for everybody on today's webinar. And thank you for everybody who's stuck through the full 90 minutes. I know you can't see that it's been very interactive, but there has been a whole lot of question and answer in the chat happening. So thank you so much for adding your questions and your experiences, and for really sharing this experience with us. Next Tuesday at noon Eastern time, we will have online abuse self-defense with Pan America as the next session in this series. Just as a final parting word today, CPJ, Penn, and IWMF all have really wonderful resources to help you as you plan your work this election season. So don't be a stranger. Please reach out to us. Please check our websites and use those resources, because we made them for you. Just a final thanks to Jen and Jeje for sharing your incredible wisdom and knowledge today. And have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for coming, guys.